Government secrecy. What a joy. We just did a story not too long ago on NSPM 7, which is the federal government directive to basically keep tabs on United States citizens, engaging what it deems to be anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-Christian, and all kinds of other rhetoric. And there's like a FBI tip line for you to snitch on your fellow citizens. If you haven't seen our story on that, highly recommend it. It's probably one of the biggest stories, I would say, of the year that got probably the least amount of coverage that it should. It's really some scary stuff. Well, on that note, we have Texas basically doing their own little version of that, targeting transgender people. The state is making a list of transgender Texans. It's using driver's licenses to help. The state of Texas has continued collecting information on transgender drivers seeking to change sex listed on their licenses, creating a list of more than 100 people in 1 year. According to internal documents the Texas newsroom obtained through records requests, the Texas Department of Public Safety has amassed a list of 110 people who tried to update their gender between August 24 and August 25. Employees with driver's license offices across the state from El Paso to Paris to Plano reported the names and license numbers of those people to a special agency email account. Identifying information was redacted from the records released to the Texas newsroom. The data was collected after Texas stopped allowing drivers to update their gender on their licenses unless it was to fix a clerical error. It is unclear what the state is doing with this information. This is really important because this is a secret list that the Texas government is amassing, and they're not telling people what it's being used for or why they're doing this, but they have the list that is known. An agency spokesperson did not respond to questions about why the list was created and whether it was shared with any other agencies or state officials. The Texas newsroom filed records requests in an attempt to find the answers, but did not receive any additional information that sheds light on what the state may be doing with these names. In recent years, GOP lawmakers have passed multiple laws restricting the rights of transgender Texans, including 2 new measures that went into effect this year. One defines male and female on state documents as being based on a person's reproductive system. The other, known as the, quote, bathroom bill, bars governments from allowing people to use a restroom at public buildings, parks, or libraries that do not match their sex at birth. While it's unclear how the state plans to enforce the bathroom bill, transgender activist Ree Vasquez told KUT News she was asked to show her ID before using a restroom in the state capitol earlier this month. Vasquez said she and 3 other people were then cited with criminal trespassing and banned from the building for a year. The state collecting this information raises a lot of red flags, not just in terms of people's privacy and ability to exist not under a magnifying glass, Landon Ritchie said. Landon Ritchie is the policy coordinator with the Transgender Education Network of Texas. He added that he wonders how this information will be leveraged in terms of drafting and crafting additional legislation to chip away at the civil rights and freedoms of transgender Texans. There are roughly 161,000 transgender adults living in Texas, or less than 1% of the population, according to the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law. Mike, as I mentioned, we covered this NSPM 7 thing, which I think is huge. This seems to be Texas's little mini version of that, targeting transgender people, of which is less than 1% of the entire population of Texas itself. What do you make of this list and what they're doing over here? What's going on?
Yeah, I think it's very peculiar that they're doing such things. It's hard to not speculate because they are not talking about what it's being used for. But obviously, like, I'm trying to withhold like firm commitment behind anything. However, I think you bring up a great point, Emmanuel, about NSPM 7, because this would be in line with that. NSPM 7, for those who don't know, is about defining domestic terrorists. And some of the indicators for those new definitions include being anti-Christian, anti-American, and having extreme views on race or gender. So in theory, being transgender, especially if Texas outlaws changing your gender on your driver's license, but if you try to do so, that could potentially be flagged as an extreme view on gender because you're trying to change your gender even though it's against the law, even though according to them that's not your real gender, whatever. So in theory they could be, and I'm not saying that they are, but they could be gathering these names and putting them on a list to submit to a joint task force that are related to NSPM 7. So that's a definite red flag for sure. And I think Texans need to hold their government accountable and figure out what are you gathering this information for? Because if they're just, oh well, we're seeing how many people tried, and then if it's like a statistical thing, then they could at least divulge that, or there should be no reason for this level of secrecy. And as you mentioned, transgender people are only 1% of the population, and transgender people in general are a pretty small minority here. So of course they're going to be targeted because it's an easy, vulnerable group. And this doesn't make it right. And when you also put into the effect of things like the Patriot Act or the PRISM program from the NSA and things like that, and surveillance and whatnot used against the American population, it can get scary quickly. So I don't want to fearmonger, but people need to be aware that these things are possible, and this is why the erosion of our civil rights and the erosion of our judicial system is a bad thing, because we're pretty much ushering in authoritarianism, and once you're in that state, it's much harder to get out. And we've seen Trump also put other people on lists so far this year as well. There's the as another video that we made where the White House published a video. It was an AI slop video of Santa Claus with a bunch of reporters on a list, and it was very strange. It was a very strange video in general. And again, it's more of the same kind of veiled threats of, oh, well, it could be a threat, but it could be a joke. Who knows? And a lot of people in the comments on X, when the White House account tweeted that out, were saying like, hey, this looks like what Nazi Germany did about putting reporters on a list and then killing some of them. So shortly after the backlash, the White House pulled the video down. So again, we've got a whole video on that. People could check that out and learn more about that. But in addition to that list, there was also something earlier in October where the DOJ was forcing two gun right advocacy groups, two Second Amendment organizations, to turn over private membership lists after a federal court case came down. And both of the gun right organizations said, "Are you crazy? No way are we turning these over." So, in effect, that could even be the beginning of like a gun registry, which I know a lot of people who are pro Second Amendment don't want. So, this is nothing new. And to see transgender people be targeted like this, unfortunately, it's not too big of a shock, given that MAGA and Trump are pushing this very, very hard. This anti-trans, I don't even want to call it a movement, but stance or policy. That's probably the better word. And we saw during Trump's inauguration speech that he declared that there are only two genders. So right off the bat, you've got him coming out being anti-trans and just kind of steamrolling from there. You also had the executive order where Trump was trying to ban transgender athletes nationwide. And that's where Janet Mills kind of stood up against him at that governor's, I guess it was like a governor's lunch. And now she's being targeted with AI slop. We have another video on that as well. But and this whole thing with the bathroom bill that you mentioned, Emmanuel, also, like, on a personal note, I don't really understand the fuss behind it, because we have unisex bathrooms. Like, if you can have a unisex bathroom, even though typically they're only one stall, they're not like a giant bathroom, but even still, in a unisex bathroom, you could have somebody walk in who's of a different sex, and that potential is always there. So I don't understand why this is such a big deal for Republicans, but it is what it is. But the last thing I just want to say is that it is interesting that they care so much about these lists, where they're going to put people on these lists who are seemingly innocent people. They're just trying to change their driver's license, their gender on their driver's license. They're not committing any crimes or anything like this, as far as we know. It has nothing to do with anything other than trying to change your gender on your driver's license. Meanwhile, the Epstein list, Republicans are dead silent about that.
What happened to the party of limited government? What happened to the party of freedom and liberty? And, if you're not harming anyone, it's no harm to me. Like, what happened to all of that? It just went out the window. As soon as Trump entered the picture, the Republican Party basically just got rid of all of its values almost seemingly overnight. And all those things that they were claiming to stand for was just turns out to be BS, because this whole transgender thing is the perfect example of someone deciding something for themselves and wanting to reflect that on their driver's license. And here comes the big federal government to come in and say no, or in this case, the Texas state government to come in and say, no, you cannot do that. It seems to just go against every conservative principle that we've been, conditioned to believe that they believe over the past decades. And Texas is like a flagship conservative state. It's a pretty deep red state. And here they are just, stomping on a lot of their own values about liberty and individualism. And it's kind of sad to see them. There's always an enemy with this administration, with the Trump administration. You mentioned they're targeting transgender people. When Trump made his announcement speech for president, announcing his candidacy, there were so many enemies named in that speech alone, namely the Mexicans and immigrants. They're bringing the rapists, their drug dealers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Casting out the transgender folks, as you mentioned. Calling out the Democrats, the left. I mean, there's always an enemy with this administration. And what Texas is doing in this case is basically just echoing what Dear Leader wants. And it's just to create enemies, to, stomp down on a minority and to take away rights from people. And it's honestly, I wish there were some Republicans still left in the party that still stood for the things that they stood for years ago, because I honestly also sympathize and believed in some of those things that they stood for, namely liberty and individualism and freedom. As long as you're not harming someone else, you should be somewhat free to do what you want. In this case, reflect your gender that you associate with on your driver's license. Imagine what it's like being a transgender person. You go to the liquor store and you want to buy some beer, and they're like, let me see your ID. And they're like, it says here you're a male, but clearly you're a female. Like, you look like a female. Imagine like all the awkward stuff they have to go through, when it could just be, remediated pretty easily with like a call to the DMV. Be like, hey, here's my paperwork, here's proof. I consider myself a female now. Please show that on my driver's license. But no, Texas state says you are not allowed to do that. We will not allow that to happen. And, I just think this is part of the big grip that the Republican Party has on the Christian movement in this country, and how they're basically using the Bible to force down commandments into law, which is exactly what our founding fathers wanted to avoid doing. They created a secular state, separation of church and state. And here we see Texas just being an example of, we actually do want this to be an ethno state and a white nationalist Christian movement. And it's clear as day in all the decisions they make. We see it from the top down, and that's where we are.